And our guest tonight is Tommy Carbone, who's written a great book called I Am Penobscot.
Maine Outdoors, from Rangeley to Eastport, Fort Kent to Kittery. The Maine Outdoors is waiting for all of us to see. The mountains, lakes, and rivers, the wildlife and the woods are just outside your doorway. So get outside and find it in the Maine Outdoors. Sunday night at 7 on WVOM to find out what is happening. Just listen to the radio, to the Maine Outdoors.
Welcome to the Maine Outdoors.
And good evening to you, and welcome to the Maine Outdoors, Maine's longest-running, most enduring outdoor talk radio program. We are so pleased you could be with us tonight. And our special studio guest tonight, he's an author, and I've only read one of his books, and I really enjoyed it so much. He's written a number of other books, I found out, and I'm going to have to check those out as well. And his name is Tommy Carbone. Tommy, welcome to our show.
Good evening, Paul. Hello, Bob. Hello, Norm. Hello, all VOM listeners.
Nice to have you here. Name of his book, by the way, that we're going to discuss tonight is called I Am Penobscot. It's a historical novel. It's about a river driver. Tommy, nice to have you here, sir.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for the invite.
All right, great. And I just enjoyed your book so much, and as I told you before the show, I was kind of interested. I never realized that you had done so many books, and all of them, the titles fascinate me. I'm going to have to get them all and read them all because you really have a handle on the history of Maine in the 1800s. And obviously you have a deep fascination with Maine in that period, right?
Yeah, there was a lot of history up in the Greenville area, Moosehead and logging history, that I was discovering from being there at camp that I thought needed to be written about in the modern age.
Yeah.
And so I discovered the writings of Fanny Eckstorm, who wrote The Penobscot Man back in 1904, and I was just fascinated with those stories because I thought it was fiction. But she was writing real-life stories about these river drivers, and some of them didn't come out of the river alive.
Yeah.
Right? It was just, the rawness of what she wrote about was phenomenal, but she was an amazing explorer. And that sparked my interest in some of the people she was mentioning, like Lucius Hubbard and Thomas Steele, and books that were out of print. So I added annotations and pictures and photographs.
When you decided to write this book, it was it's a fiction piece, but it's really good reading, and it helped me get a better understanding of what life was like for a river driver. The hero in your book, if I could use that term, is a man named David Stone Libbey. Tell us and our listeners about this guy who is the key character in your book.
David Stone Libbey is a sixth-generation Mainer, so his ancestry goes back to John Libby, who settled in Scarborough, Maine. He was a pioneer. They grew up in a log cabin in Greenbush, Edinburgh area.
Yep.
He had 10 siblings. He was basically self-educated because they worked on the farm and lumbering with his father. He didn't go to school really until he was 24, and he started out with a fourth-grade reader at that time. Here's this young man going to school, and he ended up becoming a well-known writer, an outdoor writer. And the editor of Forest and Stream always praised him for his writing, just the way he was self-taught. And some of his articles that you read, it just brings you to the woods. He talks about cutting an alder pole and putting a string on there and bending a little needle to make a hook and catching a trout. And I remember doing those things when I was a boy, right? And so you read his stories and his articles that he wrote in these magazines and periodicals, and he just had an immense way of capturing that space and that outdoors, whatever he wrote about, whether it was hunting or bears, trout, partridge, whatever he was doing, it feels like you're there.
So during the period he wrote, was it late 1800s, early 1900s?
He really started his stride in writing probably around 1876 through 1890 when he was doing a lot of writing. He wrote for Portland Transcript and the Bangor Commercial and the Newport News, and he actually did a stint where he went out to visit his two sisters who became teachers in San Francisco, some of the first teachers out there in the 1870s. And when he was out there, he was no longer river driving. He was working in a stationery store of all things, and he had time for leisure, and he started writing for Forest and Stream and did a lot of these articles reminiscing about his times hunting bear in Maine or hunting moose and the things that he learned about nature and the observations he made, about how many cubs a bear would have or the bear plug and things that, biologists now study. In his articles, you can see he was just such a naturalist.
So he was a river driver as a very young man.
He drove logs up until his 50s, digging the knees, the ship knees, out of the ground, and he would have his own lumber drive for those items.
Yep.
But he was also a boatman back in the 50s and ran a lot of the rapids in Maine and Canada, and he goes through all those adventures. And he had a journal. So Fanny Hardy Eckstorm wrote of his journals. She had his journals, and she published those in 1907. But they were very sparse notes. So I took that and said, this guy, he's like a Davy Crockett almost. He's such his life, from a river driver and a lumberman to a Civil War soldier to a miner to a stationery store worker to this outdoor writer. And you take his adventures and you could put it into this novel. It was just a learning experience for me to go back and learn about all those things that were happening.
So how did you decide to transform the original journals into a historical narrative? What seized you to want to do that?
I felt that he needed to have more recognition and be known better, and I think people would enjoy reading about this Mainer. And I'm sure there were a lot of Mainers that had lives like this, but even Fanny Eckstorm wrote, he wasn't a typical river driver. When he got to town, he didn't go to Exchange Street and Bangor to the saloon. David would go to the bookstore, and he would buy Tennyson's poems, and this is the type of person he was, because he was just trying to educate
So he
himself.
didn't patronize the brothals like a lot of the river drivers did, He was a literary type guy, and you were obviously fascinated with him, and you learned about this guy through the writings of Fanny Eckstorm. Now explain to her, who is she?
She is an outdoor writer, Maine historian. She wrote a lot about the river drivers. Her father was Manly Hardy, a fur trader and fur buyer, as his father was as well, and brewer, very famous worldwide. And he would take her out on excursions around the west branch of the Penobscot or down the east branch and do all these loops through the down east Machias Lakes regions when she had just got out of college, basically teaching her about the outdoors. She then morphed into teaching about the river drives, because her father's friends were river drivers as well. And so she wrote about all their stories, and she would hear these stories, and she went to the Ripagenis area when John Ross was running those river drives and Cornelius Murphy, and sat there in this camp. Now, this isn't a lumber camp, a lumber farm where like Grand Farm or Chesuncook Farm where there's a camp. This is a river drive that moves along down the river.
Right.
And she was with these men, the only woman there. But they welcomed her into that circle. And they told her stories, and she documented that.
Yeah. One of the things I want to ask you to do, because I think you'd be the person to do this, you've done a lot of research to try to give us an idea what it was like at a typical lumber camp. I mean, I've read all kinds of stuff, and I don't know whether it's true or it's fiction. What was the atmosphere like? How did they sleep? Did they really all bundle up together in one big bunk? And what was it like in a lumber camp? Typical lumber camp. Can you kind of paint a picture for us? What was it like?
Yeah, and I think, the difference between a river drive camp, which was tents, open-ended tents, and then the lumber camps, which are those temporary kind of log structures, and probably what you've heard and what you read is pretty true. They would throw up those log structures where they were during the winter, because they would cut an area mostly during the winter and lay that lumber next to the river, so that when the spring freshet came, those logs would float down the river. But they would put up those camps, and there would be the ram pasture, which was the name for the bunkhouse, basically.
It was called the
ram pasture.
The ram pasture, yeah.
The bar room would be, there was no bar. That was where they slept, right?
Yep.
And then you had the deacon's seat, which is the long bench that went along the front of the bunks. And they were basically almost, if you think about, walls of coffins where they would bunk up in there together.
Yeah.
And a lot of things you read about, they would say, well, that guy's pretty lousy. He had lice, right? Because they weren't really bathing and they weren't clean.
Yeah.
They were using the same blankets.
No hot shower every night, right?
No, exactly. So it was pretty rough. It was mostly dry. I mean, most of the lumber bosses didn't want them drinking, but of course, some people snuck stuff in. But it was mostly a dry area, and then the cook ruled the roost, right? You came in, you eat your dinner, you didn't talk. There was no talking.
I heard somebody was telling about that, and that most of these logging camps, it was very quiet.
Yeah, during the dinner. Because
no chatting like you and I might chat.
Nope,
you take a
allowed.
bite and then you chat.
That cook was up at 3 a.m. He wanted them in and out of there, and then when they came back for dinner, the same thing, because he wanted to go to sleep. And, he had a cookie. David Libby, who was a cookie at one time at one of his father's camps.
A cook? What's a cookie? Somebody who helped?
The assistant to the cook.
Assistant to the cook. Yeah.
And one time he heard the dog barking, and he went out to see what the dog was barking at, and the dog was barking down a hole that was covered over with fresh boughs. And David was like, the only animal smart enough to do that is a bear. So he took his birdshot gun and shot into the hole, and you could read that story. It didn't turn out so good.
Yeah.
But he was 13 at the time. What did he know, right?
Yeah. What did they really eat beans and biscuits every night?
Yeah, pretty much. Beans, biscuit, pork.
Yeah.
Pork.
Oh, man.
That's what it sounds
They
like.
must have got wicked sick of those beans.
Now, you're talking about the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s.
Yeah.
Once they had the lumber camps and then the travel got to be a bit better, they had Chisunko Camp and Pittston Farm and Chamberlain Farm.
Yeah.
And in those areas, they had more food laid up for those guys. But, back then, it was what you could carry, and it was beans.
And I can imagine brutal work, hard work in cold weather. So a man has got to be starving by the time he gets to the dinner table. Do they have like homemade pies?
Yeah, there was a lot
of
that.
sweets.
The cookie would, people would quit over lousy food.
Oh, would they?
So it was really important to have a good cook in the woods.
Yeah, the cook was key, right?
Yeah, people would migrate to those camps and be on that drive because that cook
because of the good food. No kidding. Yeah.
Yeah, my father was a cookie back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah, and he talked about a lot of people love their pastries.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I bet. Yeah, biscuits, a lot of biscuits.
Oh, yeah.
And so what was a typical day for a lumberjack in Maine? Was it like sun up till sundown, or do you know?
Yeah, a lot of them got paid piecemeal, so you would get paid for the logs you cut, right? And
they didn't get paid by the hour?
No, they got paid by that way,
Yeah.
And
Did OSHA come in and inspect? No.
It must have been tough. People like David Libby, who was a head boatman, he would get paid maybe $4.50 a day, $5.50 a day for running the logs down the river in the boat and handling the jams when they jammed, and he would be waiting there as the men picked the jam so they could jump in the bateau for safety.
Yeah. So you see, pictures and paintings of these men on the logs actually standing on the log. What a dangerous thing that must have been.
Spike-soled boots, Fanny Eckstorm writes about one of them where they're picking a jam, and the guy in the boat says, "Just jump in, don't worry about me." And the guy jumps from those logs, and he's got those spikes on his boots that are, half to an inch and just pierced into his thigh. And she writes about these stories, and you had to save your brethren. You couldn't let them die on that log.
Yeah. Wow. That was something. You know what a cant dog is?
I certainly do. That's how they roll the logs. Cant dog. Usually made by Snow and Neely for years.
And what's another name for it?
Cant dog?
Yeah.
I don't know. What is another one?
Begins with P.
Slightly different. The one has the point and one doesn't have a point. So
I didn't realize that.
Yeah, slightly different.
A PV is not the same thing as a cant dog.
A little bit different.
Different than a cant dog? Yeah. Oh, I thought they were one and the same.
Slight. Yeah, subtle.
I thought it was like Tamarack and Hamatack. No. Bob, do you know what a boom is?
Oh, sure.
What's a boom?
They're in chains. They're big with logs and chains. They boom a whole pondful, you might say, of logs and float them all down by usually a tug hauls the boom around, and they get down to the dam to let them go.
Is that how that worked?
And before they had the tugs, they used to wind it by a windlass.
They did.
And men
they did?
go around and pull that boom of logs across Chisuncook Lake.
Yeah.
And you can imagine Chisuncook or Chamberlain, when the wind came up and they just got finished getting that boom of logs down, the wind would take it right back on.
Oh, my goodness.
3 or 4 days at a time, they'd be winding that thing down the lake.
Yeah. And so they weren't allowed to drink at these camps, but they made up for it when they hit Exchange Street, right? Yeah. From everything I've read.
It used to be called the Devil's Half Acre.
Yeah, the Devil's Half Acre.
The Tenderloin down there. And Fanny Hardy Eckstorm writes, they got a bad rap. A lot of them were gentlemen.
They were.
But, she wasn't there at 9:10 at night.
Yeah. Okay, if anybody wants to get your book or any of the other books that you've written, Tommy, before we run out of time, how do they do that?
The best place is to go to my website, tommycarbone.com, and you'll find all the links there to the books and my YouTube channel and articles I write.
Okay, Carbone is Carbone.
Correct.
Tommy Carbone. Yep. And you can get your books on Amazon, right?
Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or, of course, support your small bookstores, especially Sherman's here in Maine or the Indian Hill Trading Post up in Greenville.
Okay, one other question. You studied this guy pretty closely, this David Stone Libbey. What's the takeaway? What were you most impressed about him? What impressed you most about him?
I think his attention to detail and his honesty. He really, if somebody wrote something wrong in Forest and Stream, he would correct them and give them scientific-based observational reasons about why they were wrong.
Yeah. The name of his book is Am Penobscot. It's a novel. And you can buy it on Amazon, and I read it and enjoyed it immensely. And I learned a lot about what life must have been like back then. And those people, they knew the meaning of hard work.
Sure did.
Didn't they? Yeah. Do you have any other books in the works?
I do. There's a third one in the Moosehead Mysteries series. So I've got Lobster Lake Bandits and the Elephant Mountain Gang, and the third one is being worked on right now. I can't tell you the title because it'll give away too much.
I haven't read the Elephant Mountain Gang. Does that have anything to do with that crash up there?
It does.
It does.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating site.
And that's fictionalized, but that piece in there is obviously based upon a real story.
I was up there a couple of years ago and saw that crash site.
Somber.
That was something to see, yeah. Well, look, thank you for coming. We really appreciate, Tommy, and look forward to your other books.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Norm.
Been a pleasure to have you here. You bet. Right here on
Maine Outdoors.
Sunday night 7 on WVOM. To find out what is happening, just listen to the radio. To the Maine Outdoors.